The Nile, the world's longest river. A 7,000-kilometer lifeline for almost 400 million people. Flowing north, the Nile runs through 10 countries. From the highlands in the heart of Africa to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. A source of sustenance, but also one of tension, even potential conflict. For centuries, Egypt has sought to be master of the Nile, seeking to tame the river's unpredictable flow and to ensure exclusive control over its use. But today, countries upstream are challenging this dominance and are pushing for a greater say and a greater share of the River Nile. Cairo, capital of Egypt. A teeming metropolis that has grown on the banks of the Nile. It's the first day of spring, when Egyptians from all walks of life flock to the river to celebrate the arrival of the new season.
بالتأكيد هناك في ضمير كل المصريين.
Every Egyptian wants to live by the Nile.
إذا استطاعوا فإن لم يستطيعوا.
If they can't, then at least they can sit and picnic there.
أحلامهم الصغيرة.
It's the place of their dreams.
المهمومون.
Everybody from young lovers to troubled souls come here for different reasons, either to enjoy themselves or to wash away their pain.
يزيحوا الهم عنه.
The ancient Greek writer Herodotus described Egypt as being the gift of the Nile. It was a fitting description.
The major cities that run along the Nile are only there because of the Nile. If the Nile wasn't there, it would just be another part of the Sahara Desert. You know, it would just be dust and sand. You couldn't live there without the Nile. It is the lifeblood.
Attached to this source of life, 95% of the Egyptian population lives along its banks. Just 5% of Egypt's land. The rest, just desert. The Nile may be most commonly associated with Egypt, but its waters begin their journey thousands of kilometers upstream. There are two main sources of the river. One is the Great Lakes of Eastern Africa, and the other is in the Ethiopian highlands, where the majority of the Nile waters originate. This is the summer rainy season in Ethiopia. The rainfall forms gushing rivers and tributaries. They collect here in Lake Tana, Ethiopia's largest lake and a main source of the Nile. This 600-year-old monastery is situated on one of the lake's many islands. Decorated with biblical paintings, it belongs to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The custodian of the monastery is Abba Dawit, who believes the Nile holds magical powers and is akin to God.
The
Nile is one of the 4 rivers mentioned in the Holy Bible that feeds heaven.
ከሰማይ በታች ናት።
The Nile gives us, as well as other countries like Egypt, all sorts of benefits.
የተለያየ ጥቅም ይሰጠናል።
Water isn't the Nile's only gift. The surging streams in Ethiopia turn red with silt washed from the volcanic plateau. This silt, rich in nutrients and minerals, is borne downstream. It was to prove a blessing for the first settlers in the Nile Valley thousands of years ago. Each year, rainfall in Ethiopia caused the Nile downstream to flood its banks in what is today Egypt. This annual phenomenon, known by the ancient Egyptians as the inundation, was celebrated as a divine event. It was deified in the form of a god known as Habi.
If you look at the pictures of this character engraved on the walls of Egypt's temples, you find that Habi is a strange character. He's a man with large breasts, but not a woman. He also has a protruding belly. So these two characteristics symbolize fertility and generosity granted by the Nile.
Fertility was the key gift. When the Nile flood receded, the rich silt carried by the river remained behind, fertilizing the soil, creating arable land in stark contrast to the surrounding desert. Ancient Egypt was the birthplace of agriculture. Techniques developed thousands of years ago are still in use to this day.
We still use the old plow, the one pulled by cattle. There are many tractors here. My uncle has a tractor, my neighbor has one. Everybody has a tractor, and I could borrow one at any time, but I prefer the traditional methods.
The pharaohs have long since passed from the stage of history, but some of their legacy endures. From time immemorial, the river has been a subject of adoration.
O bountiful Nile, O bountiful Nile, O bountiful Nile. Ancient Egyptians exalted the river Nile. There's an old chant that goes, people don't eat jewels, they eat the bread made from the wheat that grew on the banks of the river Nile.
But there's a darker side to this love of the Nile. Such adoration can lead to possessiveness. For the Egyptians, the Nile is unquestionably their river, above and beyond the claims of any other Nile Basin country. By the early 1900s, Great Britain ruled the length of the Nile. Egypt was strategically crucial as the Suez Canal controlled access to India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. To co-opt their allies, in 1929, Britain awarded the Egyptians exclusive control of the Nile.
The 1929 agreement stated that Egypt had the right to veto any project on the Nile that would affect its share of the waters or the flow of the river to the north towards Egypt. This stipulation was based on the fact that Egypt completely depends on the Nile waters, while the upstream countries have other water sources.
30 years later, in 1959, a second agreement was signed. Freed from colonial overrule, Egypt and Sudan agreed on dividing the river's waters. During the 1960s, African nations upstream gained independence. Nowadays, these countries are challenging agreements signed when they were under colonial rule.
Look at the other legal instrument, 1959, between Egypt and Sudan, where two countries sit down, like we are sitting now, and agree to share the entire waters themselves, and knowing very well that this water that they want share within the two countries actually emanates from other riparian states.
To this day, Egyptians regard the 1929 and 1959 agreements as technically binding. Egypt has its reasons for wanting to uphold the treaties. Its share of the Nile waters has remained at 55.5 billion cubic meters, as stipulated in the 1959 agreement. However, since then, Egypt's population has tripled to over 80 million, taking the country into water poverty.
These agreements give us a minimum amount of water, less than what we actually need. We aren't harming any of the Nile Basin countries. They don't need the Nile. They get their water from nature. The annual amount of rainfall at the sources of the Nile is 1.6 trillion cubic meters. Egypt and Sudan use less than 5% of this amount. The rest, that's 95%, is lost through evaporation in the swamps.
But sometimes rainfall is not enough. Famine has ravaged states through which the Nile flows. Here, in Ethiopia, one of the river's sources, the failure of the annual rains has led to catastrophe in the past. Millions have died. Beyond such tragedy, upstream states claim the past agreements violate their national sovereignty and prevent them harnessing the river for their own development.
I know that some people in Egypt have old-fashioned ideas. Old-fashioned ideas based on the assumption that the Nile water belongs to Egypt, and that Egypt has a right to decide as to who gets what of the Nile water, and that the upper riparian countries are unable to use the Nile water because they will be unstable and because they will be poor. These circumstances have changed, and changed forever.
The change came in May 2010 at a meeting in Entebbe, Uganda, when the upstream countries took matters into their own hands. In an unprecedented move, 6 of the 8 nations signed a new agreement declaring greater autonomy in decision-making over the Nile's waters. Aware of the agenda, Egypt and Sudan had refused to attend. What was signed in Entebbe set off alarm bells in Cairo, touching the very chord of Egyptian fear about its water source.
It is a red line for Egypt's existence. There is a difference between security and existence itself. We are wholly dependent on the Nile. We have no other water sources. So, the truth is that any threat against the Nile waters will result in the reduction of Egypt's share. This would threaten us with thirst and death.
The spectre of a water war looms over the region. For Egypt, securing the Nile waters is a matter of national security, even if it means military action. A common feeling shared by most Egyptians.
Egypt would die. What would we drink? Of course we would fight. We will fight anyone who attempts to stop our source of water.
Throughout its history, Egypt has been at the mercy of the Nile. Along the river, columns such as this, known as Nilometers, have been built to measure the height of the waters. Controlling the river was of paramount importance, with the well-being of the state dependent on the level of the annual floodwaters. The key was in finding a way to reserve these waters for use during the dry summer periods. The ancient Egyptians first attempted this, but it was the founder of modern Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha, who built the first ever dam on the Nile in the mid-19th century. To this day, the old brick dam known as the Delta Barrage still stands.
The Nile was on Muhammad Ali's agenda. It was extremely important because Egypt was threatened by drought. Muhammad Ali wanted more cotton and grain plantations, since in those days Egypt used to export these products to Europe.
Muhammad Ali himself laid the dam's first stone in 1847. But this was only the beginning. As demand for water grew, more irrigation projects were completed in the first half of the 20th century. But it wasn't until the early 1950s that Egypt began to put in place plans to finally control the Nile once and for all. In July 1952, a group of army officers carried out a coup d'etat. Egypt's king was dethroned and exiled. A new regime took power. The main officer behind the coup was Jamal Abdel Nasser, with an agenda to modernize and strengthen Egypt. Nasser adopted plans for a massive new dam to be built in southern Egypt to harness the full potential of the Nile. Called the Aswan High Dam, it would be built on this stretch of river at a cost of some $1 billion. Egypt was going to need help.
In the beginning, Britain and the United States went together and told with the World Bank, Nasser, that they were supporting the project.
However, that support came with strings attached. Egypt was expected to join the Western camp. But Nasser was his own man. In the Cold War setting, he was committed to a policy of non-alignment. A policy that displeased the Americans. On July 19, 1956, John Foster Dulles, the American Secretary of State, withdrew the offer to finance the Aswan High Dam. Nasser would not be intimidated. 1 week later, he hit back.
قرار من رئيس الجمهورية بتأميم الشركة العالمية لقناة السويس.
Nasser's decision to nationalize the company that owned the strategic Suez Canal was a bombshell. The revenues paid by ships passing through the canal could help Egypt finance the Aswan High Dam. It was a trump card, but it rattled the powers in Europe and led to the Suez Crisis of 1956. Britain, France, and Israel conducted a joint attack on Egypt to win back control of the canal. British and French troops landed in Port Said on the northern tip of the Suez waterway. But this was as far as they went. The invading armies were forced to withdraw under heavy international pressure from the United Nations. Egypt's relations with the West were shattered. Nasser now looked for friends elsewhere. In 1958, Egypt signed an agreement with the Soviet Union for the financing of the High Dam.
The Russians gave Egypt two loans, 400 and 500 million rubles. This was not aid. Egypt paid back these loans from the Suez Canal revenue.
With the Soviet loans, Nasser inaugurated the start of construction of the Aswan High Dam in January 1960. The project was immense. It is said that enough rock was used in the construction of the dam to build 17 great pyramids. Through the 11 years of construction, Egyptians saw the dam as a symbol of national pride and defiance to the West.
The Egyptian people proved their ingenuity by embracing the High Dam project. They glorified it in their songs, in TV and radio shows, movies, plays, and everyday activities. That's how it became such an icon of the nation, something which everybody rallied behind.
Nasser, the father of the project, never lived to see the completion of the dam. Just 4 months before construction was finished, he died of a heart attack. The opening ceremony in January 1971 was attended by Egypt's new president, Anwar Sadat. The dam saved the flow of over 30 billion cubic meters of floodwater each year, water that otherwise would be lost into the Mediterranean Sea. Behind the dam, a huge man-made reservoir known as Lake Nasser was created. The water held in this lake was Egypt's insurance policy against the river's unpredictable flow.
The Aswan Dam gave the Egyptians a guarantee that there would always be water there. I mean, during the drought in the 1970s and 1980s in Sudan and Ethiopia, the Egyptians, they could go on cultivating as before because they had all this water behind the dam in Aswan. But perhaps most importantly was that the Aswan Dam in a way nationalized the river Nile in Egypt.
Elsewhere, the river remained untamed. Upstream countries were still at the mercy of the Nile, experiencing at times either famine or devastating floods. But playing with nature was to prove costly for the river and for all those living off it. The Aswan High Dam, man's greatest ever effort to control the Nile. It halted the annual flood and stored a huge supply of water for Egypt behind its Great Wall. The dam was hailed as a triumph of engineering and water management. But there was a price to be paid.
Prior to the construction of the High Dam, the River Nile used to bring 4 million tons of fertile silt each year that would deposit on the land. It was like a natural fertilizer.
This silt, washed from the Ethiopian highlands, was no longer carried into Egypt. It now dropped uselessly to the bed of the man-made reservoir behind the dam. Deprived of the silt, Egyptian farmers today rely increasingly on artificial fertilizers.
My grandfather and my father used to need only 1 sack of chemical fertilizer for an acre of land. Nowadays, each acre needs at least 7 sacks.
The loss of natural fertility in Egypt's farmland was not the only negative repercussion of the Aswan High Dam. The reservoir formed by the accumulation of waters behind the dam was named Lake Nasser. Today, it's one of the largest man-made lakes in the world, stretching over 500 kilometers. It straddles the borders of Egypt and Sudan, an area known as Nubia. Situated on the banks of the River Nile, Nubia was home to many ancient temples. But in the 1960s, during the construction of the Aswan High Dam, the rising waters of Lake Nasser threatened to submerge these monuments. The United Nations spearheaded an international rescue campaign. More than 20 temples were dismantled, stone by stone, and relocated to higher ground. The largest of these were the 2 giant temples of Abu Simbel, built by the pharaoh Ramses II. In their new location, the temples remain a major tourist attraction in Egypt to this day. Archaeological sites were saved, but people living in the area received no such consideration. The Nubians, an ethnic group originating in southern Egypt and northern Sudan, have lived beside the Nile for thousands of years.
All Nubians live on the banks of the Nile. The Nile is our life, like fish. We would die if we left it.
This attachment to the river has proved a blessing, but also a curse. During construction of the Aswan Low Dam in 1899, the Nubians were forced to move. They were relocated here, on the west bank of the Nile, in Aswan. Today, the village of Khab Suhail is the most famous Nubian settlement, a place where tourists come seeking a glimpse of a traditional life.
I grew up and worked with my uncle who taught me about sailing. I worked with him in tourism, and now I have managed to buy my own small boat.
The Nubian community here has found a new way to make a living from the Nile. But a second major displacement of Nubians was to prove far more traumatic. In May 1964, Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev attended celebrations, marking the start of the second stage of building the Aswan High Dam. At the push of a button, water levels behind the dam rose rapidly. The project was on track, but at the expense of over 120,000 Nubians in both Egypt and Sudan who were forced to move.
It was very difficult to be pulled out of our homeland and taken to another place. It was very harsh. The displacement my family suffered in the Nubian region was very painful. It was a huge sacrifice.
They left everything behind. Many people died, among them many children. No one was given any time to do anything. Our people had to leave everything in a rush to catch the boat.
A civilization dating back thousands of years was uprooted. The Nubians called their homeland the land of gold. But it was now gone forever for just a meager sum of money.
My father received 36 Egyptian pounds in compensation for the house, the land, and everything else.
The Egyptian and Sudanese governments had promised the Nubians better living conditions. But their new home, away from the Nile, proved far from satisfactory.
They moved us into concrete buildings and at a stroke took away our history and civilization. They wiped out our identity. They took us away from the Nile. Nubians are only happy when they are beside the Nile, but not a single resettlement village was by the river.
Arif Jamal is a Sudanese Nubian. He was a child when the displacement occurred. Today, he teaches African history in America.
After 50 years, when you look at the new land that was acquired by the Nubians, or where the Nubians were displaced to, is a miserable reading, where you have an enormous amount of health problems, you have very bad logistics, and again, massive migration, but this time they look like refugees.
Despite the trauma of displacement, Nubians have done their best to keep alive their traditions and their distinctive language. Many Nubian songs center on a return to their lost homeland. Their dances inspired by the gentle flow of the Nile.
You can never forget your homeland, the place where you are born and the place where you die. We live now in our memories.
There is still a large Nubian community in northern Sudan, which remains on the land of its forefathers on the banks of the Nile. But even they are now under threat. In 1992, the Sudanese government announced its intention to build a huge hydropower station here in Nubia. The planned project, known as the Kashibar Dam, would use the Nile flow to boost Sudan's power supply. Once again, the Nubians face being sacrificed on the altar of development.
There is no social or environmental assessment to it. The communities are against it. We are talking about 99 villages along the Nile. We are talking about 1.5 million people. We are talking about 1 million acres of fertile land. We are talking about the last prestigious date palms that people live on. We are talking about archaeology that we did not even scratch the surface of.
The Sudanese government put the project on hold, but for the Nubians, it remains an ever-present menace.
It's just like a nightmare or a threat. Every now and then we hear the president talking about reviving this project, which is Kajabar. If they build the Kajabar Dam, this would be the last of the wonderful Nubian land.
Environmental and human factors have made many international donors wary of providing loans for large hydrological schemes on the Nile. But the rise of a new power on the world stage has given new momentum to unconditional lending.
China built up its own hydropower industry in the 1980s and 1990s. And a few years ago, they appeared on the global scene with a bang. They started funding projects which had before not gone forward because nobody wanted to touch them.
The Merowe Dam in northern Sudan is one such project. It was officially opened in 2009 by Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir amid great celebration. The dam was seen as the solution to the country's shortage of power. Its huge turbines using the river flow to generate electricity. But the Sudanese had initially found it difficult to get the project off the ground.
The Sudanese government had tried to attract funding from European governments, from Canada, from other sources for many years, and they didn't succeed because of environmental concerns and human rights concerns.
In 2003, Chinese and Sudanese officials put pen to paper on an agreement in which China would provide a substantial loan for the building of the Merowe Dam. But during the construction, clashes erupted when the Sudanese army moved in to evict locals from villages that were to be submerged by the dam's reservoir. This was exactly the sort of humanitarian suffering which had influenced many creditors to shy away from financing the dam. In the end, the protests came to nothing. The project went ahead. As the waters rose behind the dam, some 50,000 Sudanese had to leave their homes and much of their property.
I lost everything. I had over 100 palm trees. Is the government going to compensate us? If not, then our only compensation is from Allah.
Africa's large dams have not reversed poverty. They have not dramatically increased electricity rates. They have not dramatically improved water supply for people living there. What they have done is help create a small industrial economy that tends to be companies from Europe and elsewhere. And so these benefits are really, really concentrated in a very small elite.
The number of hydro power stations along the course of the River Nile is on the rise. With the exception of Egypt, the Nile Basin countries face a chronic shortage of power. Large majorities of the populations in these countries do not have access to electricity. Uganda is one such example. Here on the Nile, close to its outlet from Lake Victoria, there are 2 hydro power stations. But combined, they don't generate enough power for a country with a growing economy and an increasing population.
9% of our people have electricity.
91% don't. So we have an aggressive rural electrification program, which is ongoing, and we have a target that in the next 4 years, this number, which is today 9%, should rise to 16% in the list.
The Nile in Uganda is characterized by high-speed rapids and waterfalls. One of the most well-known is the Murchison. It's an area that attracts tourists from around the world. And it's home to Uganda's largest national park. The stretch of river here is ideal for those seeking the thrill of whitewater rafting. Toto Closer has been running rafting expeditions for tourists along the river since 1996. He has made a decent living, but these falls are now threatened by the construction of a new dam. Toto is torn between the love of his work and his country's need for electricity.
So for my comment about that dam, the electricity is good and rafting is good, so it's for them to know what is good, what is better between. I need electricity, but on the moment, I like rafting so much. I like rafting so much.
The Bujagali Dam, a new hydropower station being built here, will flood the rapids and create a man-made reservoir. But the dam will meet only a fraction of the country's electricity requirements. The Ugandan government is keen to exploit these fast-flowing waters to generate power. Another hydropower station is planned here, further downstream at the Karuma Falls, another project that threatens the natural flow of the river.
If you force a lot of the dams, it means you're extracting more water, which the rivers cannot support. And as a result, the Lake Victoria's levels went down more than 2 meters.
Lake Victoria is the largest lake in Africa and one of the most renowned sources of the Nile. Yet, it is slowly and gradually shrinking. The increasing number of hydropower stations on the Nile in Uganda is drawing ever greater amounts of water out of the lake to move the turbines generating electricity.
About half of the recent drop in Lake Victoria, which has been pretty extreme, can be attributed to these dams. They're basically opened up, and now water can be let out at any pace that the government chooses to.
3 countries share the waters of Lake Victoria. This is the city of Kisumu, Kenya's main port on the lake and the hub of its fishing industry. For 25 years, Thomas Agutu has fished here. He remembers the days when fish were once plentiful and business was good. Nowadays, he's getting a much smaller catch.
We don't have enough fish in this lake because all the water is directed to the River Nile. Look at those rocks. A while back, you couldn't see them. But now, they show how much the water level has dropped. And as they build more hydropower stations, all the water and all the fish will go to Uganda and to the Nile.
The Egyptians are content that the water continues to flow on downstream. They accept their Nile partners building hydropower plants, but they are not prepared to allow upstream countries to build dams that will reduce the amount of water reaching Egypt.
We don't have hostile intentions against anyone. We don't go to war just for the sake of fighting. But if someone is going to stop the water, Egypt will die of thirst. Then we will fight with all means available.
As populations increase and economies develop, demand for the waters of the Nile is intensifying. The question remains, who owns the river's water? Perhaps the answer may lie in history. In a bygone era, when foreign rulers once controlled the full length of the great river.